A gangster-looking man is running along a dark alley, trying to hide from someone. He stops and looks back, but doesn't notice anyone there. But when he turns back, someone holds a knife to his throat. A man begs an unknown person to stop as people pass by without noticing them. However, the unknown person showed no mercy and killed the man. A 17-year-old black-haired guy, a high school student and part-time assassin named Kyle, walks down the street with a bag on his shoulder, yawning. Kyle walks into the classroom, and everyone immediately turns to him and starts whispering. Student number 35, a member of the football club and class leader Steve, decides to greet the guy with a wide smile. However, Steve's greeting remains ignored, because Kyle decided to sleep on the desk. This behavior of the guy outrages the unofficial leader of the class girls and student number 22 Roxy. The leader of the bullies and student number 1, Scott, comes into the classroom with a dissatisfied face. Two of his classmates immediately greet him, calling him sir. Without thinking twice, Scott approaches Kyle's desk and calls out to him. Since Kyle didn't pay any attention to Scott, the second one reached out his hand intending to grab the first one. But suddenly someone grabbed him by the wrist. Grabbing the bully by the wrist, Kyle finally looks up at him and notes that he does not intend to chat for long, because he wants to sleep, which greatly angered the other. Suddenly the black-haired man squeezes the other's wrist tightly, practically breaking it. However, he quickly lets him go, apologizing, to which Scott quickly pulls his hand back and calls Kyle a creepy asshole. Suddenly, the main beauty of the class and student number 8, Rose, raises her voice, asking for silence. Intending to start a fight, Scott turns to Rose, but then a girl with a high ponytail appears in front of his face. This girl, namely disciplinary committee member and student number 29 Meryl, calls on the bully to stop before he does anything wrong. The frivolous guy and student number 23 Ryan speaks up. He tells Meryl to stop, because she will be ignored anyway. Suddenly, Kyle notices something strange right under Steve's feet, and he, to his surprise, does not notice it at all. This something turns out to be a blue glow that has arisen from nowhere. Soon this glow emanating from the pattern on the floor spreads throughout the entire classroom. However, in the next second the blue light gives way to white and absorbs the entire class along with the students. And all the guys from the class, unconscious, appear in an unknown room made of white stone with many columns and one gate. A little later, the guys regain consciousness, and Steve, having come to his senses, calls on everyone to remain calm. Scott, in turn, decides not to listen to Steve and plans to explore the place they ended up in. But he is stopped by Kyle, who heard someone's approaching steps outside the gate. In his thoughts, Kyle notes that two people are walking, a man and a girl. The gate opens, and a girl dressed in a white robe and a tall, middle-aged man in a black cloak appear before the guys. At the same time, Kyle is hiding behind one of the columns. Smiling, the girl notes that, as she expected, the guys managed to maintain their composure. Teenagers look at strangers with interest. Kyle, in turn, notices that the man is well built and armed with a sword, but does not notice anything remarkable about the girl. The woman says that she is the Archbishop of the Sacred Country, Dominica Lillian, and next to her is her knight Howard. Scott declares that this is all nonsense, and Lillian is understanding, but still denies this statement. Steve decides to take on the role of diplomat, and tries to politely obtain information. The Archbishop reports that the guys were called to another world, because they and only they are the hope of all mankind, who are able to defeat the King of Demons, the so-called candidates for heroes. Steve was skeptical about this news, and Scott, in turn, called this news nonsense. Knight Howard did not tolerate such an insult to the saint of his country. The man stood up and reached for his sword, deciding to punish the brute. But nothing further followed, because the saint ordered to stop, to which Howard replied that it was better to punish the rude man now. Scott took these words as a challenge, became even more incensed and attacked the knight, who had a weapon with him, with his fists. Suddenly, with a quick swing of his sword, invisible to the human eye, the man cut the guy's forehead. The cut turned out to be shallow, because the sword only touched the skin, but blood gushed out from the cut, which scared the others. Now all the guys were wary, and Lillian, apologizing for the rude reception, decided to tell the reason why they were here. But first she asked everyone to remain quiet. The saint said that in this world, humanity is experiencing an invasion by the King of Demons and is on the verge of extinction. However, Saint Dominica still continues to resist, but she is not able to fully resist the invaders. Lillian again said that the hero candidates were the last hope of this country, which now that the guys knew the situation better alarmed them even more. Now more and more guys began to express their doubts out loud, quietly talking among themselves, and someone even burst into tears, to which Howard said that the guys must defeat the Demon King, because this is the only way to return home. This news struck fear in the hearts of the children. Kyle couldn't tell whether it was a lie or not, but assumed that the man was preparing them for the worst, although it was quite cruel. Scott again decided to rebel, because he was not happy with the prospect of serving and obeying someone unknown. Howard appreciated that the guy had not lost his fighting spirit, which made him a promising fighter, but he considered such disobedience dangerous, and he began to think, reaching for his sword, about the fact that maybe it was worth getting rid of Scott right now. But before the knight could do anything, Lillian touched the guy's face, and light poured from her hands. A second later, the wound on Scott's forehead also began to glow, and soon healed completely. The saint then explained that she healed the wound with the help of the power of witchcraft bestowed by the god of the Dominican Republic, which temporarily brings into the world a new law, or, using the more familiar term, magic. The fact that the inhabitants of this other world knew the concepts of their world alarmed Kyle, and he suggested that most likely this was not the first call. Lillian said that this power is the main reason the guys appeared here, and reached out to Steve with a hand enveloped in light. Suddenly an unusual feeling struck the guy, as if all his organs were turning over inside, and his hand also became enveloped in light, which came from somewhere inside, flowing through his veins. Suddenly this light in his hand began to transform and took the form of a long sword shining with blue light. The saint explained that her power is to awaken the power of blessing in hero candidates, but the power is granted randomly, and cannot be changed. Lillian asked the guys to help her country, despite how selfish it was, but Steve doubted again, because no matter how much power they were given, they would not become any better at fighting. The girl promised that the country would take full care of them while they were training. Steve decided that for the sake of their survival, they should accept this power of blessing and the offer of new acquaintances. Following the guy, others agreed, following his example. The saint began to awaken everyone's powers, and Meryl was able to make her pen float using telekinesis. Scott received a blessing, an explosion. The others also received their blessings and their hands glowed in different colors. The girl asked if everyone had received their blessings, hoping not to miss anyone. In response to this question, Kyle finally came out from behind the column and spoke about what he had not yet received. And so the saint touched the guy with her hand, embraced by a gentle yellow light. Suddenly, it was as if lightning struck the guy's eyes and the irises of his eyes turned red, and for a moment his vision deteriorated. And then above Lillian's head he saw some text in a frame, similar to a game window, in which the name, age and some other indicators were indicated. Seeing that there was something wrong with Kyle's vision, she assumed that he had the blessing, assessment, which is very rare. The saint explained that with the help of this skill one can learn details about the strength and skills of the chosen target. Then the guy decided to apply his blessing to himself, looking at his hand and concentrating. Then the same window appeared before his eyes, but the indicators there were different. Suddenly Scott hit his blessing with all his might at the place where Kyle was standing, but fortunately, the guy managed to dodge, and in his place a fairly deep crater appeared. Scott's eyes lit up with an evil light as he looked at Kyle again, showing off his strength. Laughing happily, Roxy said that she was very pleased to see how the always arrogant Kyle was intimidated. The guy wondered why everyone suddenly became so self-confident, because, given the information received, he could not say exactly how useful their powers were. Kyle thought that he couldn't hope for these blessings because no one knew when they would be taken back. But what he was sure of was that there were still many reliable ways to kill a person. Lillian said hopefully that for now the powers were difficult to control, but one day they would become strong, reliable fangs that would pierce the Demon King. And then she sent everyone to rest until tomorrow, because training begins tomorrow. By evening, each of the children who became hero candidates was assigned and escorted to their rooms. But Kyle was not going to sit in his room and relax. He decided to scout out the situation and get more information. In the night, 2 watchmen stood near the walls of the building and discussed candidate heroes, who to one of them seemed like just children, unable to even hold a sword in their hands, much less defeat the Demon King. Standing behind a tree, Kyle watched the 2 watchmen and noted that this was the third patrol and that security had been beefed up. The guy decided to use his power on the sentries. A window appeared above the head of one of the sentinels, in which the only skill was fencing, from which the guy concluded that not everyone has miraculous powers, after which he hastened to hide. Having examined the territory, Kyle roughly understood the geography of the castle, namely that it was a typical fortified city, that is, a castle and a settlement surrounded by a high wall. Hiding in the bushes near the gate leading to the castle, he thought about getting inside, but still postponed this matter. To avoid being seen by anyone, he hid in the tall grass, whose tips reached his ears. As he moved forward, he noticed 3 of his classmates standing in the open area. The girls were arguing about whether it was worth being here so late at night to practice, since it might be prohibited or downright dangerous. Roxy replied, looking at the fire coming from her finger, that she still wouldn't be able to sleep, but at least it would be useful. Kyle decided not to leave, but to follow them a little and how they would use their abilities. How suddenly a rustling sound was heard in the grass, to which one of the girls immediately noticed, and then the others. A moment later, a huge blue monster covered with huge scales, looking like a lizard, crawled out of the grass. Noticing him, Kyle decided to immediately use his ability on him, because he had never seen anything like it before. The guy noted that due to the fact that the monster stunned the girls, it received the sudden status. Growling, the monster quickly rushed at the girls, and they, in turn, ran as quickly as possible from him. Kyle noted that the monster runs fast, but does not seem to be gifted with intelligence, which means defeating it will not be so difficult. The guy thought that despite the fact that the creature is huge, if you use the knife correctly, it can wound it, or even kill it. And then with a sharp movement of his hand he threw the knife straight at the monster, and the knife quickly headed straight towards the monster. The tip of the knife pierced the monster's skin, but did not seriously wound him, but was stuck in his skin. The monster growled questioningly, looking around, unable to determine where something had come at it from. At that time, the girls were still running, driven by fear and panic. They did not want to be eaten on their first day here. When suddenly one of them hits her foot hard on a stone and trips over it. It turned out that it was Roxy, and now she is lying on the ground, unable to run further without someone's help. Meanwhile, the monster is getting closer and closer, seeing a good victim in front of it, and so he swings his huge paw at Roxy. At the same time, the girl only manages to put her hands in front of her, hoping to somehow protect herself. However, the paw does not reach the girl, and the monster's head falls to the ground with a knife stuck into it all the way to the hilt. The girls move away from the monster, not wanting to look at it anymore, while Kyle hides behind a tree, waiting for them to disappear from view. After the girls leave, the guy comes up and pulls his knife out of the monster's head, worrying that since there are such monsters everywhere, you won't be able to walk around in peace anymore. Suddenly, with help, he feels that someone is watching him, and quickly, crouching, hides behind the carcass of the monster. Cautiously peeking out from behind her, Kyle doesn't notice anyone and decides it's time to quickly leave, because it's very suspicious. As soon as the guy leaves, someone dressed in a long black cloak comes out from behind the column. The face of the unknown person is not visible because of the hood. This unknown person comes closer to the monster and gets upset, because, as it turns out, these hero candidates are just a bunch of weaklings. But licking his lips, he notes that there is someone among them with a similar smell of murder and cruelty to him. The next morning, the monster's corpse appears in the room where all the candidates have gathered, and Howard informs everyone that this monster was found near the walls of the castle. The man also informs the guys that the monsters are minions of the Demon King and they love to feast on human flesh, and the guys are now their main target, and then asks a certain Sam if he has found out anything. Sam, a blonde guy with glasses and gloves stained with blood, replies that there are traces of witchcraft in the monster, and that it is the work of at least an average demon. Kyle watches all this from behind a pillar, while Howard suggests that perhaps the Demon King has decided to reconnoiter the situation. Steve decides to ask whether Sam was controlled by a demon, since such a monster could not have appeared in the fortified city unnoticed. Sam confirms this idea by agreeing with the guy and saying that strong demons are able to control monsters using a technique called slave witchcraft. And then he also talks about how monsters are made of mana, and since it turns out that the Demon King is the source of mana, therefore he and his minions are able to control it, and therefore the monsters. Howard interrupts Sam's abstruse speeches and drags him away, saying that they have to go, which makes the second one clearly saddened, because he so wanted to share his knowledge. Yesterday, using his ability, Kyle noted that the monster was in the submission status, and he assumed that he then felt the presence of a demon. However, this demon was skilled and Kyle miraculously managed to notice him, and perhaps he is still wandering around somewhere. Suddenly, someone's voice sounded right in Kyle's head and asked that he was really so scared of his imminent death. It seemed that only the guy himself heard this, which is why he froze in surprise and horror. Scott decided to speak out again, saying that he was not going to stay here for long, because he needed to defeat the Demon King as soon as possible. Rose and Steve agreed with the guy's statement. Kyle assumed that everyone was so bold because they didn't take it all seriously, just as a game, but that's not the case and they need to realize it faster. Lillian entered the hall with quiet steps, urging the guys not to rush. She stated that they do not yet understand the full essence of the powers given to them, and they need training despite the fact that they are developing faster than the indigenous inhabitants of this world. After a week of training, Kyle sat in the library, not understanding what was written in the book, but what was strange was that they could communicate calmly. Hearing the noise, the guy looked out the window. On the street, training was in full swing. Some were practicing magic, some were working out on special simulators, and some were practicing in pairs or groups. A little disappointed, Kyle noted that his assessment ability was not that useful, since he was banned from training with everyone else, but at least he was given access to the library. After reading a large number of books, the guy realized that they contained only the history of the country, but nothing about demons, and got up from the table, deciding to take a break from reading, because anyway he could not find anything useful. Going outside, the guy noted that the saint did not lie. They are developing by leaps and bounds. And he noted that among them there are 5 of the best, namely Ryan with his wind power, Scott with his powerful explosion power, Rose with her control power, Meryl with her earth power, and Roxy with her fire power. However, the one who stood out the most and surpassed everyone was another man, who at that moment knocked the sword out of his instructor's hands. And it was Steve with his sword shining with blue light, which he already wielded as a skilled swordsman. Kyle decided to use his ability on him to see how his performance increased. Seeing his skills window, the guy noted that a week ago all his characteristics were at the DF level, and now they were at the AB level. Even considering that Steve was a genius, this was an incredible leap, so Kyle assumed that the blessing also affected bodies. Suddenly those who had finished training approached the guy and began to mock him, because he did not train with them, but only read books. But Kyle noted that for some reason, everyone began to look down on him due to the result of the growth of their powers, and therefore sent him disdainful smiles. Suddenly one of the guys extended his hand to the guy, when suddenly something quickly hit him in the legs, and the brute flew to the ground. Kyle, with a dangerous expression on his face, asked why he flew like that and whether he was injured. The others stared at the brute in shock because they did not understand what exactly had happened. Scott pointed out that it was worth stopping, because he noticed that the saint was coming this way. And indeed it turned out that Lillian, accompanied by his knight, was heading towards the guys. Suddenly, the knight who was watching the training fell to his knees, and everyone looked sharply at the girl. The saint said that since the progress was higher than expected, the training schedule would be accelerated. Ryan suggested in bewilderment that they wanted to send them to the king of demons himself, to which Lillian answered in the negative. She said that it was time for the guys to fight in a real battle with a real monster. This news stunned the guys. They did not expect this, and were not ready for such training, at least mentally. And Kyle had an excited, but enthusiastic look on his face. Lillian and Howard met the guys in the forest, and the knight announced that their practice would take place in the forest. He also announced that the guys should divide into groups, because they would not be able to move in a large crowd. The first team included Steve, Roxy and another girl, the second team included Scott and 2 more guys, and the third team included Ryan and Meryl. Looking around, Howard asked if everyone had been distributed. Then he noticed Rosie and Kyle standing separately, with their arms folded on their chest. Rosie said that no one invited her to the group, to which the others unanimously thought that they were too afraid to invite her. However, there was nowhere to go, and Rosie and Kyle teamed up to form a 4th team. When the guy thought about his partner, words such as self-confident and cool-blooded immediately popped into his head. Lillian announced that the best team would receive a prize, which made the kids very happy. Rosie and Kyle walked along a forest path at a distance from each other. The girl stated that she had one of the best blessings and asked the guy to just stay out of the way, to which the guy calmly replied that he relied on her. Turning around, Rosie contemptuously noted that Kyle had no pride. To begin with, the guy decided to look at the combat potential of his partner. Using his killer senses, he noticed that he was surrounded by 4 enemies on the left and right, one in front and one behind. Suddenly, a small monster with a club, looking like a green, ugly child, came out of the bushes. Without thinking twice, he immediately rushed at the guys with a vile scream. Rosie used her abilities and everything around began to glow pink. Under the influence of this pink light, the monster was pinned to the ground and could not move. Rosie's ability turns out to be control, which forces her to follow orders. Kyle notified his partner that there were still monsters around, which made the girl worry. She ordered the monster to drop his weapon and put his hands behind his back, which he obediently did. The guy noted that the girl looked tired, to which Rosie replied that if she uses this power for a long time, she will become exhausted. Kyle noted with doubt that this power had too much energy consumption, and advised him to kill the monster as soon as possible, which discouraged Rosie a little, because the monster was vaguely similar to a human. However, the guy didn't care at all, and he replied that enemies are enemies, and there was no point in leaving him alive. The girl listened to her partner and still agreed that the arguments were very convincing and reasonable. Kyle noted that despite everything, Rosie is still an indecisive schoolgirl, but the main thing is that she makes the right decision when danger comes. More green monsters with clubs appeared ahead, ready to attack at any second, and the girl also pressed them to the ground with her strength. However, this made her breathing hitch, which is clearly not a good indicator and means that soon she will not be able to cast magic. But still it was time to finish with them, and Rosie ordered them to wring their necks. The monsters obeyed unquestioningly and broke their necks. The guy asked whether it was possible to force even this to be done, to which the girl replied that it was possible, but the stronger the opponent, the less the chance of success. The sight of the dead bodies made Rosie even worse, because even though they were monsters, they still looked like people, so this sight was unpleasant. But Kyle looked at the dead bodies not with disgust, but only with a cruel, cold gaze. Rosie didn't expect her partner to be so calm, because he doesn't even have much strength. The guy replied, examining the dead bodies, that he was not the timid type, and these monsters were just weaklings. Kyle invited his partner to come back if she was afraid, but the girl only confidently turned around and walked further into the forest. The guy noted the stable psyche of his partner, with whom he could work. Meryl and Ryan are running away from someone through the forest in fear. They are running completely, not making out the road. Suddenly the guy, cursing, sharply brakes and turns around, followed by his partner. The guys begin to cast magic, and their hands are filled with light of different colors. And combining their skills, they create a stone projectile, driven by a strong wind, which they direct directly at a huge monster. The stone hits the huge monster without harming it, and scatters into many fragments. Ryan falls to the ground in a panic, because he hoped that their attack would work, but now it turns out that they are at a dead end. A huge monster, like a bear, appears in front of the guys, and drool is flowing from its mouth. Rosie remembers her grandfather, who raised her alone since childhood, and her reason for moving back. She is determined to go back and make her grandfather happy. Meanwhile, Rosie and Kyle continue to walk forward so as not to get lost. At least the girl thought it would be right. The guy questions this strategy, because he has often been in the forest and knows that this way they are most likely to get lost. The girl turns around to look at her partner, and the question is spinning in her head about who he is and why he is so strange. Meeting their gazes, Rosie quickly turns back. Suddenly they hear someone's loud screams, in which they recognize Meryl's voice, which makes them worried. Kyle assumed that something bad had happened and asked his partner what they would do. The girl replies without a single doubt that they should go and help, and that she hopes Meryl wasn't hurt. Kyle notices with surprise that his partner is very kind, something he had never noticed about her before. However, the girl perceives this more as an insult, and tries to find out what her partner meant. Covered in wounds, Meryl falls to the ground and hits the dusty ground hard. Ryan asks his partner about her condition, as he noticed how serious her wounds look. The girl barely answers that everything is fine with her, and tells the guy to run away. But Ryan is not going to leave her alone, and he tries to support her. Suddenly a huge shadow falls on the guy, and he turns around in horror, knowing in advance that he will be behind him. Behind, swinging its huge paw, stands a bear monster, but suddenly pink threads wrap around his paw, and the monsters can no longer move it. Ryan is surprised to discover that Rosie is standing in front of him and casting a spell, but the girl will not be able to hold this monster for long. Kyle stands back and watches, noticing that his partner's power affects different enemies differently. The guy is interested in Meryl's condition, and Ryan reports that the wounds are serious, but the girl is still breathing. Then Kyle tells him to take the girl and run away. The guy tries to object, but still, since his partner's wounds are serious, he leaves. Kyle asks Ryan, who is running away, to call Steve or Lillian here to help. Now that this monster has become entirely their problem, the guy decides to use his ability. A window is illuminated above the monster's head, and the guy notes the high level of protection and the new concept of mutant. Noticing the high level of defense, he assumes that the monster has strong fur, like armor. Suddenly Rosie says, breathing heavily, that she can no longer hold the monster. The monster's paws are freed, and he is about to strike, growling in irritation because some people dared to immobilize him. Kyle says they've already bought enough time and now it's time for them to run away. However, the girl suddenly, instead of running away, succumbs to the force of gravity and falls exhausted to the ground. Her legs are shaking, the girl does not feel them and cannot get up, and panic penetrates deeper and deeper into her heart. Meanwhile, the monster is getting closer and closer, thirsting to finally finish off these little people. Meanwhile, Kyle takes something out of his cloak. Suddenly a small green jar flies out, and smoke covers everything around, protecting Rosie from the monster. The guy quickly grabs his partner's feet and lifts her into his arms, and hides with her behind a tree. Kyle warns the girl to remain silent, and she quickly covers her mouth with her hands, because she doesn't want the monster to find them. The guy lowers Rosie to the ground, and meanwhile the bear monster, wondering where his food went, looks around. The girl quietly asks her partner what kind of smoke it was that they used to escape from the bear monster. Kyle replies that it is a smoke bomb that he made out of boredom, but this, of course, is a lie. In fact, since the guy is an assassin, he is always minimally armed, his supplies are limited, and he would not want to waste them quickly. Suddenly Rosie begins to apologize, causing her partner to look at her in bewilderment. The girl explains that she is apologizing, because she was the one who brought him from here, and now she can't help. But the guy just brushes off these apologies, and in return wants to receive gratitude. Rosie thanks her partner with a cute blush on her cheeks, and childishly looks into his eyes. But this doesn't touch the guy at all, and he just turns away and replies that if she had always been like this, people would be drawn to her in droves, which is why the girl gets irritated and begins to be indignant. But Kyle reminds her again to be quiet, and Rosie quickly shuts up. They again consider a plan of action. The girl suggests running, to which her partner replies that there is no point in this and points his head to the side. Suddenly the monster hears some rustling and turns to him, realizing, however, that these are not his past victims. And now Steve's team appears before him, and the guy declares that he is now an opponent of this monster. The guy activates his sword that protects from evil ability, and everything around him is illuminated with a bright blue light. Steve attacks the monster with a scream, holding his sword tightly in his hand. The monster in this one growls, ready to take on a new challenge. The guy makes a quick swing of his sword, hoping to cut the monster's body or cut off a limb. However, he fails to do this, and he only inflicts a shallow wound on him, from which blood begins to actively flow. Suddenly Roxy screams for Steve to move away, begins to concentrate the flames in her hands, and then brings all this flame down on the monster. This action turns out to be very successful, and now the monster's fur is engulfed in flames, and he himself is struggling in agony. Roxy smugly says that she is sure that no one can resist this. Steve quickly finds himself next to his partners again. Suddenly the bear monster growls loudly, spreads its paws, and the flames on its fur die out. Roxy exclaims in horror, not understanding how this can happen. Steve urges her to remain calm, because finally there is a chance. He notices that the girl's attack brought considerable benefit. The monster slowed down. The guy encourages the girls not to give up, because now the three of them together can defeat him. And now together they continue the battle. Steve invariably attacks. Roxy attacks with her flame. The third girl also attacks with her magic. It turns out that someone is watching this battle, and with a smile of sharp teeth, He says that it is only a matter of time. The battle of Steve's team was watched all this time by the experienced demon killer Duncan. The demon notices that the monster will not be able to defeat Steve, and admires the speed of his development and his calmness. He calls the guy special. According to the plan, Duncan was supposed to conduct only a small reconnaissance. But now everything has changed. He is going to finish off Steve here and now. Meanwhile, the owner of the magic sword continues to confidently advance on the monster, striking. And then there is a blow, and blood flows like a fountain from the wound. The monster cannot stand on its feet. Steve, without wasting any time, quickly pierces the monster's chest, and the sword goes halfway into the monster's chest. Meanwhile, the demon prepares to attack, intending to teach the guy a lesson about never relaxing. And now the monster is defeated and, without moving, lies on the ground with the sword in his chest. Steve's team stands next to him. Duncan's eyes light up with crazy lights as he watches the guy, running his tongue along the blade of the knife and preparing to attack. Suddenly he feels something strange that makes his body shudder, and panic settles in his heart. Someone put a knife to the demon's throat, which he did not expect at all. This someone turns out to be Kyle, whose eyes closely follow the demon's every move. And the guy now teaches the lesson that one should never relax to the demon, looking at him with cruelty in his eyes. The knife falls from Duncan's hands. The demon raises his hands, indicating that he gives up. Duncan can't believe that someone was able to take him by surprise, because this has never happened before. Suddenly, Kyle quickly stabs the demon's legs with a knife, cutting its tendons. From this unexpected action, as if the attacker had predicted that the demon was going to escape, he falls face down on the ground. The guy leans over his victim's face, without removing the knife from his throat, and quietly tells him to remain silent, because he doesn't want Steve's team to notice them. Kyle says that he wants to ask the demon a few questions and then let him go, but Duncan does not agree to this, asking the guy who he is to do this. The guy replies that he is a shadow from another world, which immediately sticks into the demon's consciousness, and he angrily suggests that it was this creepy aura that he felt when they met for the first time. Meanwhile, Kyle continues and says that he knew what someone would do to them, but could not track down the demon, so he decided to use Steve as bait, which surprised Duncan, because it means the guy knew everything from the very beginning. Kyle replied that he had too little knowledge about this world, and then he wanted to learn about everything from the demon, which the demon was not going to agree to. Suddenly Duncan is struck by severe pain, causing him to scream, and it turns out it was Kyle. The guy threatens to give the demon hell on earth if he doesn't cooperate, to torture him to death. But the demon is not going to obey, and therefore decides to take extreme measures. He clenches his jaw so hard that his teeth begin to grind and something inside his mouth breaks. Suddenly, veins bulge on Duncan's face, blood begins to spurt out of his mouth, and his eyes begin to roll back in his head. His eyes widen, capillaries burst, and blood now begins to flow from every hole possible. After the demon stops convulsing and dies, Kyle assumes that the demon had suicide poison on him so as not to reveal his secrets no matter what. This makes the guy worried, because the army of the Demon King carefully approached the issue, which means that only serious problems can be expected from them. Suddenly, a skill window flashes above the guy's head and begins to make sounds, notifying him of something. However, at the same time, Rosie finds the corpse and Kayla next to it, and looks at the dead body with fear. The guy immediately decides to ask the girl how much she saw and heard. The partner replies that she saw little, only how he fell and nothing more. Pointing to the demon's already blue face, he tells her that it is an assassin from the Demon King's army. This news frightens the girl, and she also asks in horror whether this demon tried to kill them. Kyle responds to this that it is quite obvious that the army was sent in order to get rid of the candidates. Rosie asks her partner how he noticed him, because only he knew about him. In response, the guy decides to tell her the truth and admits that in their world he worked as a hired killer. This news plunges the girl into complete shock. She did not expect to hear exactly this. Kyle says that the girl may not believe him, but the corpse lying in front of them is strong evidence of the veracity of his words. The guy asks his partner not to tell anyone about who he is and what she saw today. Still, as Kyle reminds them, their class is already very worried about Meryl's injury. Rosie promises not to tell anyone and says that, surprisingly, Kyle is very kind and asks why he behaves this way. The guy replies that, unlike him, the others are not used to fighting, so he does this. Meanwhile, He notices that Rosie's ability can be very useful to him, and he can use it for his own purposes in the future. The guys gather around the wounded Meryl, next to whom a girl sits and casts a spell. This girl turns out to be student number 34 named Sarah, who has the blessing, healing. Sarah passes her hand, engulfed in a golden glow, over Meryl's body, and all her wounds disappear in a second, as if they were never there. Ryan asks about his partner's health, to which the girl tells him that Meryl will be completely healthy in an hour. The guy sighs with relief and expresses his admiration for Steve, because the monster was very strong and scary. Steve says that the monster was indeed strong, but together they will defeat anyone, no matter how strong the monster is. Kyle, as usual leaning against a tree, notices Rosie's gaze on him and asks her about it, to which the girl sharply turns away and denies. Lillian finally joins them, accompanied by Howard, and expresses her joy that everyone is back. Ryan, with anger on his face, wonders where they have been all this time. Howard tells the guy that they were nearby and kept an eye on everyone from afar, which makes the guy ask why they didn't help then. With a chuckle, the knight asks a counter question about whether it would be a good training if they helped every time. Then Steve decided to point out that one of the candidates almost died. In response to this, Howard said that in a real battle, every life is on the line and that now only such battles await them, and they should not whine. The guy said that everything they said was a lie, because only weak monsters should be found in this forest. Lillian noted that it could have been the work of a demon killer. She said that initially there were no armored bears in this forest, which means that someone decided to test the strength of the candidates from it. Howard suggested that this killer demo was still somewhere in the forest, to which the saint replied that it was necessary to strengthen security. And also, in the girl's opinion, it is necessary to strengthen training, otherwise all the candidates will simply be killed. A wave of dissatisfied comments went through the crowd. Steve decided that it was necessary to avoid intensifying training, and therefore attributed this not very successful outcome to anxiety, and called this decision ridiculous. But Lillian was adamant. She replied that even if it was ridiculous, you had to go through it, otherwise everyone would just be killed. Scott butted into the conversation, not wanting to listen to Lillian. Suddenly Howard appeared right in front of the guy, as if he could teleport, and he furiously explained that they were all just pawns of Mrs. Lillian, and they had no right to disobey her, and the sooner they understood this, the better. This statement surprised and shocked all the candidates, because before everyone had told them that they were great heroes, but as it turned out, everything was completely wrong. Scott became even more angry and wanted to attack the knight, but Steve stopped him by putting his hand in front of him. Now Scott was angry with Steve too, because how dare he stop and point him out. The guy explained to the other that they would be doomed if they now went against the whole country, to which Howard shook his head affirmatively and said that Steve was well aware of their situation. However, this angered Scott even more and he struck using his ability. A hot wave of flame began to approach the man at breakneck speed, ready to burn everything in its path. There was a huge explosion, and it seemed that this fire would definitely hurt anyone. The explosion gave way to a huge cloud of smoke and smoldering particles slowly falling to the ground, when suddenly Howard flew out of this smoke furiously, and aimed his blow right at the guy. The man's fist hit the guy's cheek with great force, so that he flew far away. Scott, stunned, fell to the ground and lost consciousness. The crowd stared at the guy in shock, because Scott was one of the strongest of them, and he was defeated so easily. With his actions, Howard decided to show what the young candidates are really worth, that is, nothing. And then, announcing that harsh training would begin tomorrow, he turned around and left the guys with Lillian. Soon Scott stood up. The guys tried to help him, but he pushed them away, not wanting to accept their pity. With hatred in his eyes and a smile on his face, he promised that he would definitely kill Howard. The next day after combat practice, the guys gathered in front of the White Gate, where Sam and Lillian were waiting for them. Sam explained that, by order of the saint, he would be the leader of their training today. The man asked if those who were injured in practice yesterday were okay. Meryl replied that she was fine and that Sarah's treatment had helped her a lot, and also pointed out one hot-tempered guy who is also fine. Scott snorted disdainfully at this. Afterwards, Sam said that today they would fight in his research center. Steve, having heard about this, decided to find out if this building was filled with monsters. Sam decided instead of answering that it would be faster to show them everything, and the gates began to open. The guys began to move deeper into the building, and on their sides there were cages with all possible monsters. Lillian said the research center is also used as a field training site for soldiers. Sam confirmed this and explained that it was very beneficial for him because he could gather a lot of data about the monsters based on the battles. The guys did not share the positive attitude of Lillian and Sam. They were rather frightened by the whole situation. The actual battles between the candidates and the monsters began, but Kyle, as usual, stood at the wall and watched. The guy noted that today the guys are surprisingly calm. Perhaps it's due to yesterday's experience. However, he also noticed that despite the great confidence, there was still fear in their movements. Roxy, who was fighting the monster at the moment, after a strong blow from the monster, fell onto the grass, only managing to cover her face with her hands. However, she quickly stood up and, rubbing the bruised area, was about to strike again. The monster, whose armor was slightly charred, prepared for the next blow, holding out his huge sword in front of him. Steve, who was watching the fight, began to worry a lot about his girlfriend and decided to ask Sam to stop the fight, but the scientist refused, saying that Lillian specifically asked to be stricter with the guys. Looking again at Roxy and the monster, he said that the guys still did not fully understand the state of things. The scientist said, looking at the girl who had already managed to get ready, that the hero candidates could never lose to such a weak monster. Muttering how much this monster pisses her off, Roxy raised her hand up, starting to collect a fireball in it. The fireball release reached the monster, and the fire engulfed the entire body, causing the monster to remain in agony. Seeing this, Steve was dumbfounded while the crowd cheered, and Sam replied that they were capable of this from the very beginning, only fear and hesitation held them back. Sam, surprised, asked that this was really the only problem. The scientist said that as the level of divine blessing increases, there is a chance to receive another blessing. Going down the stairs, Kyle turned to Steve and said that he had business with him. Turning around, the guy asked what was the matter, not at all expecting that Kyle would turn to him. Using his ability at half strength, which made only one eye glow red, the guy replied that he noticed that Steve had a new blessing. On the skill window, you could notice a new first-level deadly attack on a monster. Without wasting a second, the guy decidedly wanted to try out his new skill and asked to go into battle next. And so Steve entered the arena, where a monster stood in front of him, growling menacingly, and the guy began to activate his ability with a hissing sound. Steve activated his first ability, Sword that Protects Against Evil, and his sword appeared in his hand, glowing with a blue light. And then he activated Deadly Attack on Monster, causing everything around to become filled with blue light. Unexpectedly, the monster did not swear to attack, but, on the contrary, seemed to be afraid of the guy, which surprised him. However, this did not stop the guy, and he decided to make a high-speed attack. The monster did not attack him in response, but only covered his face with his hands, trying to defend himself. An obvious panic was visible on his face. Furiously swinging his sword, Steve not only injured the monster, but was even able to cut off his hand, causing it to fly upward. But this was not the end of the battle, because the monster was still alive, and the guy struck again. And this time the monster lost its head, it hit the ground with force, and fear was now forever imprinted on the monster's face. The monster's body went limp and fell to the ground, and the crowd exploded with joyful and admiring screams. Kyle thought that with such strength, even the armored bear that he met yesterday in the forest would not become a problem, and also assumed that by training, he too could receive a new blessing. Suddenly, with the help of his ability, he noticed that Scott, who was laughing while sitting on the podium, also had a new blessing. From the window, Kyle could see that this new blessing turned out to be Blessing Mine. However, he decided not to tell the guy about this and turned away from him. Filled with the desire to become stronger after seeing the fight, Kyle also decided to become stronger, and therefore thought that he also needed training. At night, several guys gathered in Scott's room, who decided to share his plan with him. Ryan was wary of this plan and asked if he was really going to do this. With an angry look on his face, Scott replied that he was absolutely serious about the fact that he was going to first kill Howard, and then capture Lillian and beat out of her away to return back to his world. Other guys picked up this idea, because they really wanted to return, and someone even suggested killing the Saints so that no one could call them again. Scott tried to convince Ryan to join them, because he knew that he was also not happy with the current state of affairs. The guy did not agree yet. he decided to first find out what the chances were that they would succeed, to which the other answered him that if Ryan joined them, they would increase much. Ryan really wanted to go back to his world, but he didn't want to kill someone to do it. But then he remembered how yesterday before his eyes the monster almost tore Meryl to pieces, and because of this he hesitated. And yet, breaking his convictions, he agreed. The next day, the guys trained again within the city walls, some in pairs, some alone. Steve was diligently practicing with his sword, not noticing anyone around. Kyle stood with his back against the tree and watched the guy. The guy, without much emotion, remarked out loud what seal the other had, and only then did Steve notice him. To which he replied with an awkward smile that he was still too weak, and therefore he needed to find a way to become stronger. But Kyle noticed that the guy was already able to defeat half of the knights of this kingdom, wondering why he called himself weak. Steve replied that he was unhappy that he was not yet able to defeat Howard, and therefore he needed even more power, and that he would not be satisfied until he could protect everyone. Kyle thought about it, but didn't answer anything, but asked what he thought about Lillian. Continuing to exercise, he replied that for her they were all just pawns that she used with knowledge, and that Howard had not lied about the fact that if they did not obey, they could be harmed. Kyle asked about the possibility that if the saint ordered, they would be sent to fight the demon king to the death without delay. The other answered with absolute confidence in his words that this was so, and everything had already been decided. But then he said that he was going to be the only one to fight him, and that he would defeat this demon king as the hero of this country. Steve said that in exchange for this he would try to negotiate a better life for everyone, to which Kyle replied that it was a good plan, but he was not sure that Lillian would agree to it. The swordsman replied that it was only for the sake of his plan and her recognition that he was swinging the sword. Suddenly, someone began to approach the guys, noting that today everyone gave their best. It was Lillian, accompanied by her knight. Sam happily went to the girl to greet his mistress. Lillian announced that while she and Howard were away, the hero candidates would remain in the scientist's care, to which Sam replied that the saint could rely on him. Roxy, hearing this, decided to clarify what "while they are gone" means, and whether this means that they are leaving somewhere. Lillian, with her ever-present smile on her face, replied that they were indeed leaving for a few days and that Sam would be their handler. After this announcement, the girl and the knight hastened to take their leave. A carriage is driving along the road, pulled by 2 horses, held by Howard, and suddenly he asks the saint if everything is okay. Under the measured sound of wheels, the saint asks what the man means. The knight calls on Lillian to stop making a fool of herself, because he and she know for sure that Scott is up to something. The girl replies, slowly sipping tea from a cup, that most likely he will try to rebel against them. Without taking his eyes off the road, the knight asks what she plans to do if all this suddenly happens. But Lillian replied, looking out the window, that she decided not to take any action, because she was curious what Scott would come up with. And Howard says that he doesn't mind, but the guy is still developing, and he is a hero candidate, albeit small, but there is a chance that they will unite. But the saint doesn't care much about this, and she replies that they still can't defeat her, that it's impossible. Howard, looking away from the road, squints in Lillian's direction and agrees with her, but he wants to say something else, when suddenly the girl asks if he thinks that this situation could be very beneficial for them. The saint says that she wanted to gradually show them their place in the world, but this uprising is an excellent excuse to break their claws. But then she remembers another dubious person and wonders whether she should be left alone. Kyle quickly runs away through the night forest from a lizard monster chasing him. Suddenly he pushes off the ground and flies into the air. From a height, with a sudden movement of his hand, he throws a knife, which hits the monster directly in the head. The monster falls dead to the ground, and Kyle, having landed and not taking out his sword, runs further, turning towards the monster's corpse. The guy notes that he was able to kill this monster in 13 seconds, and uses his new one to check if his performance has changed. However, there are no changes, except for the new skill blessing, display weaknesses. Noticing this, Kyle assumes that his level has increased since he killed the demon in the forest a couple of days ago, and now the question is how to put it into practice. Hearing a rustling sound, Kyle snaps out of his thoughts and turns around sharply, and he sees a huge pink monster flying at him with a fist, spraying saliva. The monster hits with his fist the place where the guy was standing, but the blow does not reach the target, but only leaves a mark on the ground. Kyle, who managed to dodge, ends up on the side of the monster. He takes out 3 small knives from his cloak and with a sharp movement of his hand throws them straight at the monster. However, the knives do not pierce the monster, but only bounce off the skin, leaving not a single trace, which angers the monster even more. Kyle felt panic when he noticed how hard the monster was, but quickly gathering his thoughts, he once again dodged the monster's blow, thinking that this monster was an ideal experimental subject for experiments. The guy activated his new ability display weak points, and suddenly the back of this monster's neck glowed with blue light. Then the guy pushed off the ground again and soared into the air. Finding himself behind the monster, he took out a knife, aiming exactly at the place where the axle was illuminated with blue light. The knife plunged into the monster's neck, from which blood was now flowing profusely, and the monster howled in pain. At the same time, Kyle landed, and the huge carcass of the monster fell to the ground dead. Looking at the monster's neck, the guy noticed that his ability pointed to the softest place of the monster's skin. Looking at his hand, Kyle noted that this is a good strength. However, this is not enough to survive in this world. The guy was filled with the desire to become even stronger. Suddenly, 3 small monsters with clubs ran out of the bushes with piercing screams. The guy used weakness display again, and the monster's forehead and part of the chest in the area of the heart glowed with a bright red light. In a quick movement, Kyle threw 3 knives, and these knives hit the hearts of 3 little monsters, throwing them back. The monsters fell to the ground dead, kicking up dust from the ground. Kyle, taking a knife from the chest of one of the monsters, noticed that, of course, the weak points of these monsters turned out to be their heart and brain, and noted that this new one was very useful against ordinary monsters. Kyle wondered if he should look for other types of monsters to test this ability of his. However, just as he was about to move out, he heard a man approaching him. From the bowl of the forest, hidden by the shadow of the trees, a dark figure was approaching, holding a glowing lantern in his left hand. Finally emerging from the shadows, Rosie could be seen illuminated by the moonlight, who immediately turned to Kyle. Kyle turned his head sharply and asked the girl what she was doing in the forest at such a late hour. Approaching closer to the guy, the girl replied that she walked around the hostel several times while looking for the guy, and also decided to check the forest, and was right. The guy sighed and replied that Rosie should quickly return to the dorm, because it is dangerous in the forest at night. The girl indignantly noted that it was worth telling her, because Kyle was the first to go into the forest. The guy replied that he was used to the restrictions of the night, but the girl was not, and besides, fighting monsters in pitch darkness is not so easy. But the girl did not want to listen to this any further and asked what the guy was doing here. Kyle answered seriously and honestly that he was experimenting with his new blessing. The girl, not believing what the guy was saying, asked again. The guy reminded the girl of what Sam had said earlier about blessings, namely that by increasing the level of blessing they could receive new blessings. Then Rosie asked what kind of blessing Kyle received. Kyle turned away from the girl, asking what was the point of telling him about this. This outraged the girl, and she said that she was worried in vain and came here. Turning around, the guy, with a slight smile on his face, asked that she was worried about him. The girl, stuttering, shouted with a reddened face that she didn't mean that. Not paying attention to this, Kyle turned his head back, saying that it was time for the girl to return, and he would still stay and experiment. Rosie answered resolutely that she would go with him, when suddenly she noticed something with her peripheral vision and turned her gaze to the side. It turned out that the girl noticed the smoke and wondered what was going on there, to which Kyle also noticed and turned his head. This smoke came from the dormitory building, which was completely engulfed in hot flames. The guys from the hostel in their pajamas ran out into the street, where they were met with threatening roars by hungry monsters. However, not everyone was far from the fire yet, so Sarah and another girl ran away from the fire. Suddenly, a huge red monster appeared right in front of the healer, opening its mouth wide in a threatening roar. But then a blue flash flashed by. It turned out it was Steve, who cut the monster and, holding the girl by the shoulder, held her back. The guy sympathetically asked the girl if she was okay. The girl quietly replied that she was fine and thanked the savior. Suddenly, 5 small monsters with clubs appeared in front of them, which Steve immediately noticed and put his hand in front of the girl. Taking his sword in his hands, the guy excitedly noticed that there was no end to them. Suddenly, with a loud crash, a huge wave of flame flew at these monsters, burning them alive. It turned out to be Roxy, irritably noting that this fire and monsters had disturbed her sweet dream, and she also wondered where these monsters came from. It turned out that Scott was standing behind her, who replied that it was not the time to ask these questions, but first they needed to deal with the monsters and the fire. Kyle and Rosie hurried to join the others. Seeing them, Ryan was relieved and said that he was very glad that no one was hurt. Kyle replied that they went out for a short walk and asked about what happened here. But Ryan himself did not know what happened here. He said that he just escaped from the fire and there was a horde of monsters. Then Kyle noticed that this was more similar to human methods, which means there must be a puppeteer somewhere nearby whom they must track down. His guess was confirmed by Sam, who suddenly appeared, taking the guys by surprise. The guy sat imposingly on the wall, putting one leg on it, while slowly burning particles flew around him. Looking at him carefully, he said that he had been wondering why there was a whole bunch of monsters here. However, if Sam was behind everything, it began to make sense, and that these monsters were from his research center. The scientist replied with a smile that Kyle was right, and noted that the monsters had to be strengthened with drugs so that they were suitable for his plan. The guy angrily asked the man about his purpose and benefits in killing hero candidates. Sam honestly answered that he received an order from above that he must destroy hero candidates even at the cost of his own position, but he personally does not hold a grudge against them, but they will have to die. Rosie asked in horror if this was an order from above. Could it really be an order from Lillian? However, the scientist, standing up, replied that Lillian, whom he called a fox, had nothing to do with this, and the order was given to him by the Demon King. Ryan, dumbfounded, asked if Sam was a spy for the Demon King's army. Then the scientist replied that if he succeeded in this attack, he would be able to continue his research. To which Kyle replied that he was too carried away with his research that he was even rotten to the very bones. Throwing up his hands, Sam triumphantly replied that he would not be able to understand the mysterious essence of monsters while he himself remained human. Numerous battles with monsters continued actively in front of the burning dormitory building. Sam triumphantly watched these battles with a guard of 2 monsters, and his cloak fluttered in the wind. The scientist, looking down with empty eyes but with a smile on his face, commanded the monsters to attack, and the monsters, obeying the command, rushed towards the guys. Kyle called out to Rosie, urging her to use her ability, which the girl understood and raised her hand, using her ability, ordering them to stop. The monsters, under the influence of the girl's ability, glowed pink and stopped. The girl, continuing to cast her spell, ordered the monsters to attack Sam. Hearing this command, Sam grinned, saying that it was a pathetic attempt, and ordered the monsters to wake up. Unexpectedly, the scientist's command worked, and the monsters were freed from the girl's control. Discouraged, Rosie exclaimed, not at all expecting such an outcome. The scientist with a radiant smile reminded him that he was a scientist, which means it would be strange if he didn't have a way to pacify the monsters when they start to riot. Now Sam commanded the monsters to attack, and they obediently rushed at the girl. Kyle, who was crouching behind the girl, took out a knife and told her to bend down. And then, with a quick dash, he killed 3 monsters, striking at their hearts. This sight stirred the scientist's twisted heart, and he burst into laughter, asking Kyle to give him even more sights. The rest of the monsters immediately attacked the guy. With a quick movement, the guy inflicted a deep wound on the chest in the area of the green monster's heart. With the next blow, he crouched sharply and plunged the knife into the head of the blue lizard monster. A huge red monster was about to attack him from behind, but Kyle noticed it and turned his head. Turning sharply, the guy raised his leg and hit the monster hard on the head. This blow stunned the monster, and it fell to the ground with a loud sound, throwing its head back. Having finished with that monster, Kyle looked sternly at the other monsters and stood in a stance, preparing to face a new fight. However, the monsters were not going to attack. They froze, looking fearfully at the powerful enemy. Sam asked in fear what is wrong with them, because this guy doesn't even have a really useful blessing. Kyle decided to use his ability on the scientist. When the skill window opened to the guy's eyes, he immediately noticed the slave witchcraft skill and realized that Rosie's ability didn't work because the monsters had received an order from a higher level. Since things didn't go according to plan, Sam decided to use his trump card, which he didn't want to use. Standing on the wall, he took out a whistle, and a loud, piercing whistle was heard. Kyle, not expecting what the scientist did, asked what he was up to. Sam replied with a smile on his face that the guy would soon understand everything. Preparing to attack, Kyle took a step forward and said that he would get rid of him faster. But he did not have time to finish his sentence. Suddenly he saw something unexpected in front of him. It turned out that a huge fireball was flying towards him. But the guy managed to dodge and the ball crashed into the ground. The guy jumped several meters away from the fireball. Suddenly, raising his head, he saw something he did not expect to see. There was a huge red dragon in the sky, preparing to release another fireball. With a loud roar, the dragon opened its mouth, preparing to attack again. Standing on the wall, Sam solemnly announced that this was the red dragon and his best trump card. The dragon, in comparison with which everything seemed small, lowered its gaze down, looking for a new target. Suddenly he jumped from the roof of the house, destroying the chimney, and fragments of this chimney flew down. Pieces of the chimney flew straight towards Kyle, Ryan and Rosie. In a second, Rosie realized that she would not be able to dodge this stone, and she froze in fear. But before the stone touched the girl, Kyle saved her by jumping away from that place, holding her close to him. Releasing the girl, he asked if she was okay, while preparing for a new attack by the dragon, which was in the sky and looking right at them. Kyle asked the same question to Ryan, who was standing behind, and then said that the next attack would be coming soon, and ordered the guy to take Rosie and leave. Flapping his wings, the dragon quickly flew down. The dragon appeared in front of the guys and Kyle screamed, getting its attention as Ryan quickly ran away with Rosie in his arms. The dragon roared furiously, raising its head and thereby opening its neck, where one place glowed with blue light. It turned out that it was Kyle who used his ability to find a weak point. The guy slashed at the dragon with his knives. However, his blow not only did not wound the monster, but also his knives shattered into small fragments. Suddenly Scott, standing on the roof of the house, exclaimed that such a giant was just for him, and, shouting for the dragon to die, and activating a new ability, Explosion, he delivered a powerful blow. This blow stunned the monster, and he raised his head, trying to recover, and Scott flew down with a perky smile. Upon reaching the ground, Scott looked at the dragon and exclaimed, mocking him. But his joy quickly ended, because something happened that scared the guy. The dragon, quickly coming to his senses, breathed fire directly at the guy with even greater fury, which is why he did not have time to dodge, but could only cover his face with his hands. Scott's clothes and hair caught fire, and he began rolling on the ground in an attempt to put out the fire. The guy managed to put out the fire, and he turned to Kyle, because with a sigh, he said that there was no point in relaxing. Getting to his feet, the guy turned to Scott to tell him his plan. Kyle said that together they could defeat this dragon, while the dragon was preparing for a new attack. Scott asked in a pretentious tone what use Kyle had to him. Kyle replied that he knew the dragon's weak points, however he needed Scott to get to them. To this the guy replied that he was not going to team up with a small weakling. Kyle did not respond to the other's statement, but only noted that the dragon was returning. Now the monster decided to strike with its tail, which swept away everything in its path. The guys were able to dodge the giant tail by jumping in time. Noticing that his attack was not successful, the dragon, with bubbling sounds, again began to concentrate the fire in its mouth. Scott, who had just avoided the tail attack, had no time to prepare for the dragon's next attack, and so the dragon again directs a wave of fire at the guy, from which he again does not have time to dodge. Having taken 2 attacks from the monster, the guy barely gets to his feet. Noticing this, Kyle teases the other, saying that if he is so confident in his abilities, then let him continue. In the end, Scott agrees and asks where he needs to hit. Kyle points him to the upside-down scales on the dragon's throat. The guy easily notices this diamond-shaped scale. Convinced that Scott has noticed her, he suggests that he distract the dragon, and he will hit the weak point, and then asks if everything is clear. The guy confidently replies that he understands everything and is in a hurry to start. Still standing on the wall, Sam urges the dragon on, asking him why he is hesitating, and then he desperately orders the dragon to quickly kill the guys. The dragon responds furiously to the order, opening its mouth wide. The dragon begins to take off, flapping its wings, thereby creating strong gusts of wind, and then, landing again, he growls furiously, opening his mouth wide and sticking out his tongue. Kyle is throwing knives again. Knives that fly into the dragon's face fly away without hurting it. Turning his attention to the guy, he turns on him as he runs away. The monster tries to grab the guy with his teeth, but he deftly dodges and runs on. Suddenly the guy stops, sliding along the ground. The dragon's neck ends up near the ground as Scott quickly runs towards it, and Kyle gives him the go-ahead. At speed, the guy falls to the ground and I drive right under the dragon's weak point. And then, using his ability, he strikes directly at the dragon's weak point. The charred dragon makes puzzled noises as its head falls down. The dragon loudly falls to the ground dead, and this causes fragments and crumbs to fly around. Sam watches all this, stunned. Not a trace of his former fun remains. Kicking the dragon's head, Scott taunts the monster, calling him a jerk. Kyle teases the guy for saying this even though he can barely stand, to which the other tells him to shut up. Looking up, Kyle asks the scientist what he will do now without his trump card. Sam, looking around in panic, replies that he still has a bunch of monsters down there. However, looking down he saw that all the other monsters were dead. Steve says that they killed everyone else, and the guys glare at the scientist, preparing to attack him. Sam takes a step back in panic, intending to escape. However, Ryan appears from behind, flying up to him with the help of his wind power. Taking a step back again, the man stumbles, and starts flying down the wall. But before he hits the ground, he falls into a water ball, which stops his fall. Sam emerges from it. Opening his eyes, the first thing he sees is a knife pointed at him. It turns out to be Kyle, who says that he started the battle in the middle of the night, but took it too long, and he has a lot of questions. The scientist, in a panic, asks the guy not to kill him and expresses his readiness to answer all questions. But then the man begins to experience incredible pain. His eyes change color to purple. A second later, Sam falls dead, his face turning purple and bleeding from his eyes. Kyle reports that the scientist died, and Steve asks what it was, to which the guy replies that perhaps it was some kind of curse technique. Steve then concludes that this curse killed Sam after he promised to tell everything. Kyle says that most likely the threat from the army of the Demon King in their direction will only grow. The next day the knights went to inspect the scene. Lillian, who has already returned, covering her mouth with her hand, says that she cannot believe that this happened in their absence. Pointing his finger at the saint, Ryan is indignant, because it was she who entrusted them to Sam, which means she should have at least suspected something. In response to this, Lillian smiles slyly, covering her lips with her hand, and then he notices that apparently there was a misunderstanding. The saint laughs and says that she wanted to say that she did not expect the monster Lord Sam to do so much damage. The guys are stunned by this statement. Roxy angrily clarifies, asking if she really knew everything from the very beginning, but did nothing. To which Lillian replies that she was talking about toughening up their training, and this is just the beginning. One guy exclaims that they could all have died, because Sam set the dorm on fire while most were asleep. Howard responds to this by telling him not to whine and not to let his guard down even at night, otherwise they will die instantly. Kyle notes in his thoughts that even he did not have time to notice that horde in time, and asking schoolchildren to do this is real madness. Lillian decides to talk about the main topic and reports that the guys are going to the capital. Steve, confused, asks why they need to go there. The saint replies that hero candidates are the main topic of discussion in the country, and that a parade will be held in their honor, and the people will be pleased to see the heroes of the occasion. After long hours of travel, when night had already fallen, Howard announced that it was time to take a break, and they would move on at dawn. The guys set up camp, set up tents and lit fires, sitting several people around one fire. Sitting by the fire, Scott noticed that there were 30 people here and tore off a piece of dried meat with his teeth. Two other guys did not understand what he was talking about. Then the guy explained to them that they were guarded by 30 people. He noticed that there was no one serious among them. One of the guys says Scott would have done them in one hit, and asks if he's up to something. The guy replies that this is a great chance for their plan. The other guy hesitantly agrees. The guys notice that there are usually more people around them, and they are also weaker than them. Biting harder into the meat, Scott also notices that these patrolmen don't care about them, so they don't even suspect that the guys are going to start a riot. The guy takes a sharp bite of meat and says that today they will definitely run away, and orders the guys to call Ryan and the others. It turns out that Kyle was standing by the tent all this time and eavesdropping. Kyle agrees that they don't have many soldiers assigned to them, and they are all weak. But he is sure that the reason for this is that Lillian and Howard are confident in their abilities, and the guy needs more time to understand them. Kyle approaches Steve, who is sitting near the fire, and calls out to him, to which he turns. The guy asks him to give him a minute. Everyone had already gone to their tents, in which the lights were now on. Only the guards remained on the street. Meanwhile, Scott and his team hid in the forest. Scott checks with the guys to see if everyone except the guards has fallen asleep. Ryan replies that it looks like it. Suddenly, right in front of the guys, Steve and his team appear. Coming closer, the guy asks if it is true that Scott plans to kill Lillian and all the soldiers. In response, Scott asks who told him about this. Steve replies that she heard it herself when she walked past his tent. Roxy says she doesn't like them herself, but killing them is crazy. Scott replies that they are the only ones who are crazy and asks how long they intend to follow Lillian's lead. Steve says that he understands the guy's feelings perfectly, but there must be another way, because murder is not the answer. The rebel asks what the guy's plan is, to which he replies that he is going to become Lillian's pawn and defeat the Demon King, and in return he will ask to provide everyone else with safety and housing. Scott doubts that the saint will agree to this, but Steve assures him that if he gets stronger, she will have to listen to him. The rebel, spitting to the side, rejects the guy's plan and defense and tells him to get out of his way, because he's heading back to his home world. Then Steve says that since the guy is so serious, they will have to stop him. Scott's team prepares to take the fight. The rebel hits Steve in the face with his knee, but the guy manages to cover his face with his hands.